And the activism goes back in time. And we have to understand, to put what's happening today in this incredible context of the movements that have made this country great. One of the unions being targeted by Governor Walker and by CASIC in Ohio is AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. The union was founded in 1932 in the midst of the Great Depression in Madison, Wisconsin. Its 1.6 million members are nurses, corrections officers, child care providers, EMTs, and sanitation workers. It is instructive to remember that it was the struggle of the sanitation workers of AFSCME Local Number 1733 that brought Dr. Martin Luther King to Memphis, Tennessee in April of 1968. Remember why Dr. King died. He went to walk with the sanitation workers as they carried those placards that said, "I am a man. I am a man," and the terrible, violent retribution they got for simply trying to unionize. And Dr. King thought it was that important to march with them, to throw his support behind them. In 2005, Democracy Now! Went down to Memphis for the National Conference on Media Reform. The next conference is happening in April in Boston, and we'll be broadcasting from there. That's Bob McChesney's group, John Nichols' group, who's been so active in the rebellion in Madison, Wisconsin. But before we went to the conference, we flew into Memphis and went to the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was gunned down on that fateful day, April 4th, and got to meet all sorts of people who had remembered him being there. Like a guy who was very young at the time. He said he was a kid, no good, out in the streets with his friends, and his father was a sanitation worker. And his father, he told us, said to him, "You're coming with me to hear Dr. King's speak at the Mason Temple." And he said, "No, I don't want to go." He says, "You're coming." He says he went. And there was hundreds of people packed in. The rain was driving down on the roof of the Mason Temple. The women with their heels tapping on the ground, waiting for Dr. King to come. Ralph Abernathy called back to King at the Lorraine Motel and said, "You got to get here." He wasn't feeling well, Dr. King. He wasn't going to give a speech. He said, "I can't replace you. They want you, Martin." And so he came in and he gave the speech that no one would ever forget, the mountaintop address, that he might not get there with them. And he didn't. The next day he would be gunned down at the Lorraine Motel. A year to the day before he was killed, on April 4th, 1967, Dr. King was giving another critical speech at the Riverside Church in New York, the Why I Have a Dream, the Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam speech, Beyond Vietnam, the speech that we give, that we broadcast every single Martin Luther King's birthday. It's not as well known as his I Have a Dream speech or the Mountaintop Address, but it's absolutely critical and certainly as important. It was a speech that his own advisors said, "Don't give." They said, "Martin, you've achieved the highest you could have possibly achieve in this country. You have the President of the United States behind you. You got Lyndon Johnson to sign the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. You have accomplished all that the Civil Rights Movement could possibly accomplish. Do not now turn to the war in Vietnam and antagonize so many people. This is not your struggle." And Dr. King replied, "If I care about brown and black babies at home, I care about them abroad, that the war at home is directly linked to sending brown and black soldiers abroad to fight in a war that he did not think was just." And he gave that speech to a packed house. And he said the country he loved, America, had become the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. He was roundly attacked by almost every sector. The New York Times, Time Magazine, talked about his demagogic speech. It sounded like propaganda out of Radio Hanoi, they said, as he spoke against the war in Vietnam. Unbelievably brave, taking on union activism at home and taking on the war abroad. I think that was the beginning of his demise, but also that was a continuation of his greatness. He refused to compromise on these basic principles. And I think we have to talk about the movements as we look at what happens everywhere from the Middle East to the Midwest that have made this country great and put everything in that context. Which takes me to Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, the greatest abolitionist in the United States ever. The man who spoke out against slavery because he himself was enslaved, born in the eastern shore of Maryland. Frederick Douglass grew up on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was enslaved as a youth and a teenager. He was handed to a man named Edwin Covey, who was known as the slave breaker, who would take the troublesome slaves. And it might not surprise you to know that Frederick Douglass was a troublesome slave. And so he was handed to Covey. Covey's property was Mount Misery, and Covey beat him and tortured him. But Frederick Douglass fought back and escaped, ultimately came north and changed the world. I go to a little coffee shop in New York, a little old brick building that has a plaque on the outside that said, Frederick Douglass took refuge here when he came to the printing press of a freed black man named David Ruggles in this building that is now a coffee shop. And I thought that is so interesting. Frederick Douglass, who ultimately founded the North Star newspaper, and David Ruggles had a printing press, that they saw the media as their form of liberation. Information is power. But let's go back to Mount Misery on the eastern shore of Maryland. Mount Misery today is owned by Donald Rumsfeld. He bought it as his vacation home in 2003 to be near his close friend, Vice President Dick Cheney. Donald Rumsfeld was Defense Secretary then. So when I said this last night at CU Boulder, one of the students said, I don't believe you. So I said, that's really good. That's very good to be a critical thinker and not just believe everything that you hear. In fact, I didn't believe it when I first heard it, and I read about it, and I investigated it, and still, I couldn't quite believe it. So Dennis and I headed down to St. Michael's, Maryland to see with our own eyes. This was years ago, when Donald Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense. We got to St. Michael's, and I realized I had no idea where Secretary of Defense lived. But we saw this organic coffee shop ahead of us. You can see there's this theme in my life. I said, we should go in there because they'll tell us the truth. So we went inside, and they said, what would you like? I said, I'd like to know where the Secretary of Defense lives. And they said, just go out back, you go down the road, you'll hit Mount Pleasant Road, don't go down that road, make a right, another right, you'll be on Mount Misery Road, take that road to the end, and you come to his house. So we got in the car, we didn't go down Mount Pleasant Road, we took a right and another right. Seems we couldn't go right enough. And head down the road, and we see the black tinted windows of the Secret Service. I get out quickly and I pull out my video camera and I'm zooming in as they're zooming out. And I'm thinking, does Donald Rumsfeld know the significance of this property? Right. And sure enough, as I'm zooming in, I see this stake in the ground and it says Mount Misery, right next to the driveway. Yes, we had arrived. Down the road, there's this old ancient black church. It's Sunday morning, so we headed off to the church then. And they were just about to have Mass, and there was an older woman sitting in the sanctuary, and I said to her, what do you make of this place? It's so historic. You have Frederick Douglass, who was born here, who was enslaved here, who was tortured at Mount Misery, and now you have Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld owning Mount Misery, who's known for torture. What do you make of this? And she said, I can't comment right now, we're in church. So, Mount Misery to Mount Hope. I was speaking after that in Geneva, New York, upstate. And after the talk, a young woman came up to me and said, I'd like to take you to Mount Hope Cemetery, where Frederick Douglass is buried. It's in Rochester, where I was flying out of the next morning. I said, oh my gosh, but I'm flying out, like to go to Denver. Early tomorrow morning, I can't do that. She said, oh please. So I said, all right, it was in the middle of a huge snowstorm.